Spend 5 minutes looking at the community response to Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, and you will find a massive subset of avid FromSoftware fans who share the exact same sentiment. Promised Consort Radahn went too far. Even elite challenge runners who can beat him at rune level 1 walked away calling the mechanics tedious and overtuned. For many who've been playing these games for years, Phase 2 felt like a miserable departure from the peak combat design that made games like Dark Souls 3 feel so satisfying. Most fans agreed that the fight was visually stunning, capturing the raw cinematic weight of a battle against a literal god. But it felt like an encounter exclusively balanced for elite tier, no-hit pros who can perfectly parse layers of blinding light and avoid every frame trap flawlessly. For those reasons, countless experienced fans of the series walked away feeling forced into a compromise. They conceded their preferred playstyle to rely on a Greatshield or Mimic tier, just to end the eye-searing nightmare that is Phase 2. That is, if they didn't drop the game entirely. And look, I was basically right there with you. Personally, Elden Ring was my first FromSoft game. I was just getting to the point where I wanted to stop using summons when I made it to the DLC. Mainly because I felt like they made some of the bosses a bit too easy, and I didn't get the same level of fulfillment using them. So going in, I wasn't even sure if I would be able to beat this boss without a summon, but I may have used something even stronger. On my first playthrough of the DLC, I opted to use the Blasphemous Blade's ranged fire attack, Taker's Flames. It still took hours of practice. Phase 2 is incredibly punishing, even with such a powerful ranged weapon skill. And it is really powerful. Not only does it hit Radahn from range, it has incredible hyper armor, and you regain health anytime an attack lands. This makes it easy to trade with him and come out on top. But because that weapon is so notoriously overpowered, I walked away feeling like I didn't get the full experience. Later on, I beat the boss using a shield poke build, using the sword lance and the fingerprint stone shield, and I was honestly surprised how easy it made the fight. If you just keep the shield up and continue poking, the boss essentially beats itself. I finished the fight in less than 30 minutes, but this also felt kind of cheap. I wanted the fight to be manageable, yes, but not this easy. It just didn't feel right. On my third playthrough, I tried to beat him melee only. I was using power-stanced curved greatswords, relying heavily on the Bloodhound Fang's weapon skill. It was a disaster. Bloodhound's finesse locks you into a really sick, cinematic, completely suicidal animation. Most of the time, Radahn just poised through it and smacked me out of the air, leaving me seriously questioning my life choices. I kept running out of healing flasks early in Phase 2 if I didn't get deleted by one of his combos sooner. The regular power stance swings were too slow, the damage was mediocre, and I eventually got annoyed and went right back to the Blasphemous Blade. This was especially frustrating because that exact Bloodhound's Fang build, complete with optimized buffs and talismans, had absolutely melted through every other DLC boss with relative ease. Why was the final boss not just twice as hard, but seemingly 5 or 10 times harder than every other boss in the DLC? It felt like a completely different game. I walked away convinced that a pure solo melee run was an exhausting marathon only viable if you possessed flawless robotic reflexes and a sixth sense for detecting convoluted hitboxes. I was completely wrong. By changing up my entire approach, I returned to the Gate of Divinity and secured a solo, shieldless melee victory with no ranged attacks on my 5th attempt, spending a total of just 15 minutes on the actual fight. If you dropped the DLC at the final stretch, or walked away feeling like you had to resort to a strategy that you didn't enjoy, this video is for you. There is absolutely zero shame in using a Mimic tier or raising a Greatshield. This boss pushes human limits. And of course, play the game whatever way you enjoy most. But if you want to go back and claim a solo melee win on your own terms, you don't need to be a mechanical god. You don't need to play perfectly. You just need to organize your resources and switch to a plan that shifts the odds heavily in your favor. To break through the frustration of this encounter, we have to approach the challenge from 2 distinct directions: improving our evasion, while also optimizing the offensive and defensive capabilities of our build to ensure that we don't have to evade for very long. If you attempt this fight using a standard setup that deals standard amounts of damage, you force yourself into a grueling endurance race against a gargantuan health bar. The longer the fight lasts, the more opportunities the boss has to catch you off guard with some type of Phase 2 fuckery. The goal here isn't to dodge perfectly for 10 minutes straight. The goal is to maximize our active damage output in defense, so we only have to dodge just long enough to stay alive. To maximize evasion, you really need to demystify his attack strings. This is not a dodge guide, but I can point you toward the absolute best resources for it. Fextra Life's guides are always a decent place to start, but for a detailed breakdown of every single attack combination string, I highly recommend Big Bart's video comparing Consort Radahn's nerfed attacks side by side with the original launch versions. Even though you only need to focus on the updated versions, seeing the frame data comparison is incredibly eye-opening. A key term to get familiar with is recovery window. That is the brief period of time where this boss finally stops attacking and gives you your opportunity to attack. With the nerf, most of his recovery windows were increased by roughly 16 frames. That gives you about a quarter of a second more to attack before you have to go right back on the defensive. Just seeing a visual breakdown of these combinations in both phases changes your mindset. You don't need to memorize every combo string, but watching it makes it crystal clear which attacks are followed by a guaranteed opening and which ones require you to dodge and evade for like 15 or 20 seconds. All of the examples show him avoiding the attacks flawlessly, so it's a fantastic way to program your brain on how to respond to the visual chaos. Once you have a decent grasp of his movement, you can get to the part of planning that I enjoy most, the build. As my example earlier illustrated, if you try to lean on any type of weapon skill that locks you into a long animation, you'll be so cooked. Unless you're running a highly specialized tank setup, where you spam the Endure Ash of War, and that is an option, weapon skills generally won't be the best solution to this problem. But there is one thing that keeps this boss from being completely unfair. He has several explicit vulnerabilities which you can exploit. He's weak to pierce damage, highly susceptible to Scarlet Rot in Phase 1, and vulnerable to poison, frostbite, and bleed. Also, most of his sword swings can be parried. Now the internet is flooded with broken build guides for Consort Radahn. I would be careful with some of those. Some of them are fragile glass cannon builds that rely on perfect RNG. If you get hit by a single Phase 2 clone combo, you're immediately back to the loading screen. Instead, I'll show you the exact setup that worked for me. I knew bleed would be essential because Radahn sits on a massive health pool of nearly 50,000 HP, which scales even higher in New Game Plus. So of course, the percentage-based damage that bleed deals would be a highly effective way to cut through all that HP. I also decided to use a weapon that does pierce damage to take advantage of that weakness as well. So I went with the plus 25 Blood Sword Lance. It's a heavy weapon with excellent base damage, but it's also capable of attacking 3 or 4 times within a couple of seconds. This makes it perfect for dealing lots of damage and bleed buildup within those short recovery windows. By applying the blood affinity, we give the weapon Arcane scaling. This allows the bleed buildup to scale dramatically as you upgrade the weapon and as you level your Arcane stat. At 57 Arcane, my bleed buildup reached 165 per hit. I procced bleed 3 times during my winning run, each proc tearing through roughly 6,000 points of his health. These were my stats when I faced him with this build. Yes, my level was relatively high because this was New Game Plus, so I dumped many of my extra points into endurance. If you are tackling this at a lower level, don't worry. You can achieve similar results by putting fewer points into endurance, and potentially running the 2-headed turtle talisman to compensate for that, if needed. Also, you probably know that most of your damage output and defense in the DLC is determined by the Scatistry level, much more so than your rune level. So this is one area where you don't want to cut corners. You want to be at Scatu level 15 at the very least, although I would recommend getting it to 18 or 20. In terms of armor, I went with Moore's Verdigris set for massive physical defense, with one exception, the White Mask. It grants a 10% damage boost for 20 seconds the moment blood loss occurs, which pairs nicely with our 165 bleed buildup. Speaking of buffs, it's time to talk about all types of buffs. In terms of talismans, to focus on survivability as well as attack power, I chose 2 defensive talismans and 2 offensive. On the defensive side, the Dragon Crest Greatshield talisman. Radahn deals absurd physical damage in both phases. Unless you're planning to no-hit the fight, go with this talisman to get a flat 20% physical damage reduction. Also, the Golden Braid. This reduces holy damage by 22%. It's essential for surviving the holy light attacks that Miquella throws at you in Phase 2. On the offensive side, we have the two-handed sword talisman. This gives us a clean 15% damage boost whenever we are two-handing our weapon. Also, the spear talisman. This increases thrusting weapon counterattack damage by 15%. So, anytime you're using a thrusting weapon, if you hit an enemy while they're actively in an attack animation, your weapon will always get a 30% damage bonus. This talisman stacks an additional 15% right on top of that. This means trading hits with Radahn occasionally isn't a mistake. It's a great way to get in some bonus damage. Next is the Flask of Wondrous Physic. Many players pop this before the Fog Gate, but I recommend saving it specifically for the start of Phase 2. Your pre-fight spell buffs will naturally run out near the end of Phase 1, so if you use it at the beginning of Phase 2, you'll have some additional support for the remainder of the fight. In this flask, I ran the Opaline Hard Tier. This reduces all incoming damage by 15% for a full 3 minutes, easily the best defensive tier in the game. And also the Thorny Crack Tier, which ramps up your damage with consecutive attacks. This pairs beautifully with our rapid poke strategy during Radahn's brief recovery windows. Now let's talk about spell buffs and item buffs. This is where it's important to consider which of these buffs stack, meaning both buffs take effect at the same time. Buff stacking might seem like a basic topic, but you'd be surprised how often I've seen people canceling out their own buffs because the buffs don't stack. I recently watched an experienced player cast Flame Grant Me Strength at the Fog Gate and then immediately eat a boiled crab. The problem is that both of those are classified as body buffs. Eating the crab completely wiped out the 20% damage boost from the incantation. Hopefully the placebo effect carried them through. You can generally only have one buff active from each of the main buff categories at one time. To get the absolute most out of your setup, you want to have exactly one buff active from each unique buff category so they run simultaneously. You obviously aren't going to have all buff types active at all times, but that's just kind of what you should shoot for if you want to get the most out of buffs. So, for my aura buff, I chose Golden Vow. This spell grants a flat 15% damage increase, as well as a 10% boost to all damage negation for 80 seconds. For the body buff, Flame Grant Me Strength. This gives a massive 20% increase to our physical attack power for 30 seconds. This also boosts fire damage just in case you plan on using fire attacks. For the weapon buff, I chose the Crag Blade Ash of War. Applied directly to the sword, it boosts physical damage by 15% and increases stance damage by 10%, and it lasts 60 seconds. And for the regeneration buff, Blessing of the Erdtree. This requires 38 faith, but it restores 12 HP per second for 90 seconds. This can be incredibly helpful in recovering some HP while you're busy dodging Radahn's extensive combos. If you don't have the faith stats for it, Blessing's Boon or Bestial Vitality are great alternatives with lower faith requirements. And in terms of consumable item buffs, I did use a Boiled Crab in Phase 2, which boosts physical damage negation by 20% for 1 minute. Boiled Crab is perfect for Phase 2 because it's a body buff, like Flame Grant Me Strength. But Flame Grant Me Strength will have worn off by the time we reach Phase 2, and it takes just a split second to use during any small opening during the fight. Also, it's very easy to complete the quest line to unlock unlimited Boiled Crab from a vendor. One reason we go through this trouble with buffs is because Elden Ring's buff stacking is generally multiplicative, not additive. So if you stack two separate 20% damage buffs, the game doesn't just do 20% plus 20% equals 40%. No, it calculates it as 1.2 times 1.2 equals 1.44. You end up getting a 44% total damage increase. And that bonus damage just continues to increase as you stack more buffs. This type of multiplicative math explains how high-level challenge runners can one-shot some bosses, dealing tens of thousands of damage in a single hit. However, these are usually no-hit runners, so they're able to focus entirely on offensive buffs. Our buffs will go to defense as well, so we won't get such absurdly high numbers. Now, to manage the high speed of the fight, I highly recommend dedicating some time to setting up your quick pouch. I mapped critical items like Mikola's Great Rune and Boiled Crab directly to the pouch. This allowed me to use them instantly during the fight, without ever having to cycle through my standard item bar and potentially forgetting to switch back to my healing flask. I also took the extra step of completely unbinding the crouch action from the L3 left stick button. This is completely optional, but sometimes I bump this and go into stealth mode during a boss fight, which is just annoying. Thankfully, FromSoft didn't carry over the accidental kick mechanic from Dark Souls, so that's one less thing that can go wrong. Also, I mentioned Mikola's Great Rune. You should strongly consider using this to cancel out the effect of Mikola's Charm if you get grabbed in Phase 2. This is a common run ender if you happen to be locked in an animation when the grab comes out. In case you weren't aware, this is a reusable item that you get from beating Scattertree Avatar, so go clap that sunflower. Also, I should mention flask allocation. I went with one blue flask so I could refill my FP after pre-fight buffing. I did this in case I wanted to use Cragblade during the fight, but once I realized how good my damage was, my priority shifted to using Boiled Crab for better defense instead. So I really didn't need the extra FP. I would have been fine going with 14 healing flasks. So I would say go with 14 healing flasks unless you want to use weapon skills. Once you actually step into the arena, your general game plan is relatively straightforward. Like most boss encounters, your first priority is to dodge as much as possible and wait for a clear opening before you start swinging. But once you do find that opening, don't be afraid to go for an extra hit or two. Because of how this build is structured, trading some damage with him is usually worth it. Every extra poke you manage to get in pushes you that much closer to triggering the next massive bleed proc. You also want to take advantage of pre-fight buffs in Phase 1 before they run out. Plus, as we covered in the buff section earlier, if you happen to keep swinging right as he initiates an attack, your boosted counterattack damage kicks in, and the Thorny Crack tier will actively reward your aggressiveness with even higher damage for consecutive hits landed. Just don't get completely blinded by greed. If you miss a window, just back off. You're going to get another chance to attack very shortly. Try to keep the combo strings from Big Bart's breakdown in the back of your mind, so you can anticipate when you need to lock in for an extended dodge sequence, or if your window to attack is opened. Avoiding damage is obviously crucial, but staying aggressive when the time is right is the best way to burst down his health bar quickly. For example, this is how things played out in my winning run. Right off the rip in Phase 1, a single fully buffed R1 light attack connects for an incredible 1590 damage. With our 165 bleed scaling, we aren't just chipping away at his health bar, we're tearing through it. We trigger 3 separate bleed procs over the course of the fight. Each one lands for a massive 6,000 damage. If you end up far away from him occasionally, this is a good time to let your stamina recover and get a heal in if needed. If you stay far away, you can bait out his corkscrew dive bomb attack, which is easy to roll into and punish. And with that, we close out Phase 1 easily, with 12 healing flasks remaining. This is when the real fight begins. Radahn starts Phase 2 with his Mikola's Light nuke attack. Once we make it out of the AoE, it's the perfect time to pop the physic. The Opaline Hard tier reinforces defense, and the Thorny Crack tier rewards consecutive strikes. The first couple of attacks landed to over 1k damage, so the pre-fight Golden Vow buff is probably still active. But shortly after, a single attack does just 970 damage, so the pre-fight buffs have worn off at this point. For this reason, I start to focus on landing at least 2 or 3 hits at a time when I have a decent opening. This will take advantage of the Thorny Crack tier, as well as the passive buff from the Spear Talisman. Notice right here where Radahn begins his Bloodflame Blade attack. Instead of dodging, I played aggressively and continued to attack. The attack right before it does 970 damage, but the following hit jumps up to 1603. This is likely due to the counterattack boost that takes effect when you land a hit with pierce damage while an enemy is midway through an attack. And at this point, Radahn's health bar is below 25%, so he flies into the clouds to do his signature human meteor dive. Once you've made it out of the blast radius, you have a few seconds to pop a heal or a quick buff. In this case, I went with Boiled Crab for a 20% boost in defense in the final stretch. And honestly, the crab is what saved this run. The final minute of the fight was incredibly chaotic. Shortly after the human meteor, I landed the third bleed proc, and I just needed to land a few more hits to win. This is when greed took over. I got caught in his grab, but I only needed to land one more hit at this point, and I still had 4 healing flasks remaining. However, in classic Soulsborne fashion, the more I tried to rush in and land that one last hit, the more I got caught in his combos and had to back off to heal. Eventually, he pulled out his worst AoE attack when I was already at half health. By the time this absolute onslaught finished, I survived with just a magic pixel of health remaining. It must have been 1 HP. Fortunately, I had a chance to use my last remaining healing flask shortly after, and dodged just enough to finally land that last hit. I think this example demonstrates how defensive buffs can be just as crucial as offensive buffs for this fight. It also shows how this particular build can work, even if you're still learning the dodge timings. Again, this was my 5th attempt on this playthrough. At the end of the day, Promised Consort Radahn remains a widely disliked, intensely restrictive, and legitimately obnoxious boss fight. The blinding holy light and severe visual clutter in Phase 2 are genuine design flaws. If you looked at this encounter and decided that shifting your entire build or repeatedly banging your head against a tedious mechanical wall wasn't worth your time, that makes total sense. Video games are fundamentally supposed to be fun, and walking away from a design you flat out do not enjoy is a completely rational response. But this win proved to me that it's still, at its core, a traditional FromSoftware boss. He is not a flawless action script that demands robotic perfection. He's a classic RPG puzzle with explicit mechanical vulnerabilities. It's Miyazaki's flawed, awe-inspiring final exam for a game that always expected you to find some way to overcome extraordinary odds. You don't need to be a flawless challenge runner to beat him melee only. You might need to respec and reorganize your toolkit, but you can absolutely claim this win on your own terms. If this breakdown gives you a fresh perspective or the motivation to head back into the realm of Shadow, drop a like. It helps a ton with the algorithm. Leave a comment letting me know how your battle with the consort went. Now stick around to watch the full winning run with no commentary.